And thank you so much for coming to our session today. I'm Ziyan, joined by my colleagues Fran, Rawlings, Muliro, and Lichty. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that affects us all, yet is misunderstood. And we will get to that in a second. But first, big thank you to the Dubai Future Foundation, the Museum of the Future, the organizers for having us. And thank you all for choosing ours, because there are so many amazing sessions right now. There are other sessions even I want to be at the moment. So much appreciated. So without further ado, we will launch into the deck as soon as the deck loads. Yeah. Minor technical difficulties. But that's what kind of life is about, and that's kind of what our topic is about rolling with the unexpected, rolling with things that come at you. So in a second, I believe the deck will be up. And if it doesn't, we're going to have some fun. I'm trying every direction now. Let's go. There, hello. And now you get a sneak preview of everything. This is great. It's like a movie trailer. So we're going to talk a little bit about why futurists should be talking about grief, and in general, policymakers, designers, and the like. So we're going to basically have a few opening remarks, a panel discussion with our wonderful colleagues. So we've got Arthur Muliro and Dr. Lichty with us. We're very excited to have them. And then a bit of a Q&A if we have time. So almost everybody in this room will experience grief at some point in their life. So will people outside the room, don't worry. But almost everybody will. It's a universal experience. And what grief is our body's natural response to loss. And it unfolds in both the mind and the body. And we see it can be seen systemically as a disturbance in the natural equilibrium of societal, familial, and individual systems. So we can see that it has major physiological and psychological impacts that range to chronic inflammation, cognitive impairment by up to 60%, and increased risk of heart attacks. So contrary to popular belief, it's not something you can just easily get over or walk off. There are major biological components. And we see, through a series of interconnected variables and events, that unresolved grief can have a tremendous impact on our societies. So we can see it in the form of strain on social services, strain on our legal system, healthcare system, and more. In terms of monetary value, it costs North America alone over 100 billion USD every year in costs related to productivity, healthcare, and social support systems, things like absenteeism, increased workplace errors, cue the cognitive dissonance, right? We're talking about decline by performance in about 60% in some people. And we see how that shows up here in costs. So today, we're going to talk about grief as it relates to our past, present, and futures, and why we feel it's helpful for futurists to think about it. So how did we get here? So Fran and I are part of an agency called Method Collective, and we try to build resilience into products, services, processes, and organizations. And we have a multidisciplinary skill set that has enabled us to work across sectors, industries, and scale, working with clients, including the Canadian government at federal, municipal, and provincial levels, international healthcare, cultural bodies, and more. And we use a combination of strategic foresight, systems thinking, art, and life-centered design, and operate at that intersection. So how we arrived at grief, our process involved understanding people and their needs, and how they come together across tech, business, design factors. And being from Toronto, which is one of the world's most multicultural cities, allowed us to get a really diverse frame of views. We, through mapping systems with national athletic organizations like Curling Canada, we found a lot of grief by mapping out the life cycle. Typical things like grief from early retirement, grief from injury, but you also have tremendous grief from people who win Olympic gold medals. That was a surprising one to us, and it comes from the fact of either reaching the pinnacle or recognizing the sacrifices that have been made in life for a few minutes at the podium. We found tremendous grief across the legal system in Canada through service blueprinting of all major functions ranging from evidence to verdict delivery, and things like disenfranchised grief, grief from injustice, and more. We could have a full presentation on each of these types of grief, But for the sake of time, we'll give a quick primer. We've explored grief with indigenous communities in Australia, Mexico, Japan, Canada, and found tremendous grief from desecration of knowledge systems, desecration of ways of life, and more. And then grief in the arts and music sector, but through work with City of Toronto, the Pathwaves Project, Suzanne Stein, our collaborators here in this room, right there. And we found that loss or major transition is a very natural part of the human experience and will affect everybody, if not most people. This can be individual sources of grief, like the loss of a relationship, job loss or career change. It could be something broader or societal, like war and conflict, housing crises, economic downturns, and more. So this brings us to foresight and design. So we're looking at collective grief of populations, past, present, and future. So things like historical grief arising from intergenerational trauma, things like war, colonization, natural disaster. Present grief, there's a lot of it around political grief, grief of economic recessions, and then anticipatory grief for the future. Things like climate change or World War III. Then, interestingly, there's the grief that comes when you do get what you want. So when it comes to preferable futures, sometimes there's the concept of opportunity cost and what you've sacrificed to get there, or the regret, or FOMO. So then you've got unattainable futures as well, where many societies mourn prosperity or tech utopias that they could not have due to changing circumstances or flaws in the system. So when it comes to futurists, there's also an increased risk of secondary trauma mirroring distress of target audiences and populations studied, things that can impact personal triggers, but also compassion fatigue, ironically, which can arise from continuous engagement with grief. And this shows up in practice through bias in thinking, perhaps skewing foresight, skewing the way projections play out, or even balancing objectivity or the way you show up with stakeholders. So we're seeing that there are tremendous individual and societal costs. It impacts everyone, so why aren't we talking about it more? We see a number of problems ranging from academic misinterpretation to over-medicalization of grief, their stigmatization of expression, who can grieve, for how long, where, and when. And then these show up in our workplaces and institutions, in our bereavement policies, where in Canada, for example, even if you've lost a child or parent, you get 2 to 4 days max. And based on the stats and figures we've shown, that really doesn't facilitate a comfortable re-entry into society. So we see that grief is stigmatized, ignored, and often misunderstood. Even something as basic as the stages of grief, the model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, is one that's widely known, and it sees grief as this linear path, whereas in reality, it can be very unique to each person and rarely linear. What brought us to this work was after the COVID-19 pandemic ended, we witnessed collective grief on a very interesting scale. And we noticed people were grieving the losses of loved ones, lifestyles, careers, and ways of working. And despite this high demand, cities, workplaces, and institutions alike did not provide the type of assistance that people were hoping for. So we wanted to try an experiment, and are still in the middle of this experiment, technically. So we brought together some of our systemic research, our client work, our experience in the arts and in a variety of disciplines, and tried out some of our sessions with the National Hockey League and Curling Canada, and wound up having very positive responses. So we tried this prototype, an immersive public art installation exploring community healing and bonding through grief, called Space for Grief. And we wound up hitting a nerve, something unexpected. We wound up getting a large amount of media coverage across the country and abroad. We were able to have a number of partners reach out to us, including the National Health Service in the UK, Canadian Grief Alliance, and more. And what's better is the busiest library system in North America reached out to us to host our first installation, and our second was hosted in nature at National Geographic Top 10 rated ecotourism destination, Evergreen Brickworks. And what was the best part for us were the thousands of people that came. We had over 25,000 visitors, and people left thousands of messages, really powerful things, multi-generational, multicultural, across ages, kind of showing the universality of grief and how it was affecting people. And, you know, it was tricky getting here, and we had a lot of design considerations here. using systems thinking to map grief's ripple effects, using tools like CLA and SteepV, exploring the narratives around grief, the signals and scenario building, and then using that information to design trauma-informed and participatory spaces where people could feel included. And then we looked at psychology of the senses, and that affected our musical choices, lighting, and then finally looking at cultural rituals and collective memory. So here are a quick few snapshots of what some of the spaces look like and some of the engagement. And they range from learning and education to spaces for meditation and reflection. And we've already covered the impact a bit, so in the name of time, I won't spend too much time there. But why designers and futurists? Why should we all care about grief? It enhances our empathy, it connects futurists to emotional landscapes, and it allows for better human-centered approaches to be built, and life-centered, arguably, considering sustainability and our biodiversity. It informs strategy, uncovers barriers, and it enables more effective policy and initiative implementation. And it facilitates transitions and change management better by having people feel heard, can increase buy-in, and then we find it builds resilience and also ensures inclusion. So before we enter our panel, I'd like you to just sit with this one thought. What or who have you lost? And how does that memory still live with you? And how has it shaped who you are today? Now, I would like to invite our panelists and fellow moderator Fran up, and Arthur and Stephen, please join us up on stage here. A big warm round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. And Arthur and Stephen, if you don't mind doing a very brief, quick intro of yourself, and we will get started.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. My name is Arthur Muliro. I work at the Society for International Development, which is an international non-governmental organization. We do many things in the space of futures, and yeah, it's going to be a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon and to learn from you. Thank you.
How are we doing over there? We ready? I'm Stephen Lichty. I'm foresight practitioner in Kenya, so I'm kind of Arthur's brother, but in another part of the world. And yeah, looking forward to this. I think the themes arising from the previous sessions and flowing into this one are going to be really important. So look forward to seeing what we contribute here from us and from the rest of you.
Hello, I'll just make my intro very quick. I'm Fran Quintero Rawlings. I'm also a co-founder of Method Collective and Space for Grief, and I'm honored to be here today to talk to you a little bit more about our work and where we are, where we're going, and to have some awesome discussions after this. So, Ziyan, do you want to go?
I feel like we've been talking long enough. I'm Ziyan. I'm also co-founder of Method Collective and Space for Grief. I'm a systems designer and a musician, and yeah, I do like to do things.
Yeah. So grief is this kind of invisible thing that exists in all of our work, but we don't actually talk about it a lot. And so wanted to start with a question to each of you. And maybe Arthur, you can kick us off. So how have you observed grief showing up in your work? And you can maybe start with there and let that unfold.
Thank you, Fran. So how did I end up in this space of grief? I'm not a professional psychologist or anything like that. But how I came about it is, and I'll tell you a little bit what we do, is we have been doing national level scenarios, public interest scenarios, which in different countries in Eastern Africa, starting in 1995, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia. We've also been supporting work in Zimbabwe, in Lesotho, in Bolivia, Israel, Palestine, and a couple of other places. And when we do these country-level scenarios, they're not the quick things that you imagine that happens over a weekend or a month or two. They are 18-month processes. And in these kind of processes, what we try and do is to try and understand why is a country the way it is and what has shaped it. And in the conversations we have, one of the things that we ask people is, what is your earliest political memory? Now, working in Eastern Africa, a lot of what you are dealing about is people struggling. At the time, it was really struggling with the shift from single-party politics to plural politics. And what did this mean for those societies and what was emerging there? Now, in one of the countries we worked in Uganda, we asked this question, and there was a silence in the room. In Kenya, for instance, what was your earliest political memory? Well, it was a rally, a political rally. It was a statement that somebody made, so on and so forth. But in Uganda, there was this silence. And we struggled, myself and the facilitating team, to understand what was behind this silence. And later on that evening, one of the people in the room came and said, during the Civil War, I actually shot someone. And they died. And that in itself, if you like, confession, allowed, and it sort of pulled a cork on something that was happening. And people began to talk about their experiences, because the group of people we were talking about largely came about in the period when Uganda had been going through the Civil War. And so most of the earliest political memories were shaped by that. And it was a brutal civil war, as most of them are. And that made me begin to reflect on, so what are we doing with all of these emotions that people are holding within them? Because we sometimes approach the work of futures as a logical, rational process. But you're dealing with people, and they bring their emotions, resolved or unresolved, to the table. And this also then informs what kind of conversations, what sort of futures, what kind of aspiration they will generate. And because of this, I've got onto a journey which, in a sense, culminated, meeting with the Method Collective here that had this method of spaces for grief. But one of the key questions that we have been asking in our part of the world is, how do we deal with the burden of history? And in those countries of Africa, which are largely countries that came out of a colonial past, the colonial history was not necessarily always a nice one. It was violent, people were displaced, and so on and so forth. And this history is still very much present with us today, and it is informing some of the choices that we are not able to make. And we need to find a way to be able to speak about these things and to resolve them. Otherwise, I think we will continue to be held back by the legacies, the traumas, the unspoken things that continue to dominate our lives. Thank you.
So building on what Arthur says, I work maybe on the other side of that, more in communal communities that are suffering from some of this violence that Arthur talked about. So working with marginalized communities, that youth coming out of gangs in Mombasa, youth coming out of Al-Shabaab, youth coming from just abject poverty and so forth. And so what we work with is, I think of it as 4 hyphenated adjectives to describe this. So it's community initiated, it's healing centered, it's trauma transformative, and it's youth led. So we're really tapping into those generations. So working with a 12-week intervention program with these youth and youth led and so forth. And what we're seeing is to engage with the future, you have to reconcile the past. And for many of the youth, we're giving them that space to do that. And so that's so crucial. So there's the reconciliation that happens, and then there's a re-engagement with the present. Like the past begins to be reconciled. And this is done almost with biology sort of lessons, helping people understand the limbic system in your brain. And this is what your brain does on trauma, and it's not you. And moving it to this foresight, really good foresight, is driven from the neofrontal cortex, where you can critically engage with material and thinking and creativity and so forth. So we're seeing, even in a 3-month period, seeing youth move from that stage, and then enabling them to reimagine a new future for themselves. But even in the midst of that, one of the challenges Arthur and I were kind of talking about in the panel is just the intergenerational. This track is empowering generations. This is not a youth track per se, but it's empowering generations. So sometimes that empowerment might entail older generations empowering generations and moving some of in Kenya, the cultural gatekeepers are often the wazee, the Swahili for the older generation, and the younger generation is ready to move, and it's these systems and structures that are often still an obstacle. So I'm speaking from Kenya, but I think a lot of this energy, a lot of this space, it's not just Kenya. All of you are coming from all parts of the world. If you would look at what is the situation with youth in your country and where does the country want to go, I think there's parallels across the board there. So,
Thank you so much for that. And based on your experiences, how would you approach grief when it comes to a multi-generational standpoint that works with this trauma? What are some frameworks or resources that you found have worked especially well? It doesn't have to be any established framework. It's even a mental model or just a way of engaging with folks.
Well, one of the things that we tried and in kind of work was using art. When we did the work in Kenya, one way we were able to get people speaking about some of these things was to dramatize the scenarios. So we used a method which is called IPSET, Participatory Community Education Theater, and it allowed the audiences to become part of the stories. So they had to tell the end of the story, right? So they got the initial elements, and then they had to join in. As you'd be asked to now tell the end of the story. And that generated debates and allowed people to engage and to share different aspects that maybe if it was a formal presentation, they would not have shared. I think it also allowed us to learn how different communities internalize some of these things, because there's some places where they have been through, culturally they are more together. They have had processes that allow them to deal with some of these things within their own spaces. Largely within the urban spaces, which are very fragmented, is where these conversations were also very difficult to have. But again, the medium of art, music, theater was quite instructive for us, helping people to engage on that.
For us, I mentioned them kind of in those 4 hyphenated adjectives. Community initiated. Communal is so important. There's a huge emphasis for more of a biomedical approach, even in Kenya, where trained psychiatrists, that top, if you're familiar with the World Health Organization's pyramid, that bottom layer is where this communal and self-help is really geared. So there's all these sort of frameworks and paradigms that I can share with people who are interested, but something that I think is most helpful for everyone in this room is just a quote from Brené Brown, who says, "People are doing the best that they can." And she actually doesn't like that quote because she's like me. She's like, "No, they're not. People can do better. Why are they being so stupid or lazy or just judgmental sort of attitude?" But it's the idea that people's personal trauma, your own history or whatever, or what just happened to them that morning, severely, not severely, it does impact how we do things. So people are doing the best that they can. And when you unpack that neurobiologically, it's completely true, that the brain circuitry is working with what it has. Now, neuroplasticity would suggest that can be changed, and it can, and we're seeing that change.
That's great points raised there. And Arthur, when it comes to art and design being used, and especially when it comes to trauma responses of the brain and neuroplasticity, one interesting thing we found with art especially, and looking at things like music and film, that they're very dense in information. 1 minute of music or 1 minute of film has the potential to convey a lot of information and also to bridge cultures, especially when it comes to music or rhythm. And when it comes to the brain and how it works, art and music can directly have impacts on brain chemistry and even the way we shape our logic models.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm realizing that we somehow, in spite of the technical glitches, we are ahead of time.
Well, Ziyan, let me just, so there's research where they're using functional MRIs and asking people to reflect on the past. Certain parts of the brain light up. Then when we're asked to think about the future, the same regions are lighting up. And it makes sense. Like if I ask you to dream about the future, I had an amazing childhood. My dreams are fantastic. Like nothing, there's nothing that barriers or boundaries for my dreaming. But for someone who is living in poverty, living in marginalized communities, they're thinking their future is one day, 1 week, maybe 6 months out. But asking them to think 10 years out, like I've had youth say, I don't think I'll be alive.
No, and that's powerful. And the mindset and outlook is really critical for how you think about your future, whether you think you'll be around, like you said. And when it comes to MRIs and brain imaging, it's so true. The way different centers light up, even with and the same type of stimuli, right? We found that with music, live music causes, even with the same song, live music on brain scans causes much more parts of the brain to light up than through recorded music. And, before we open it up to the audience for questions, Fran, we have one last question for you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was like, I'm just like in the zone. Okay. My question for you is any advice that you may have, or do we want to do the advice or do we want to do the DFF one?
We can do both. We have
Okay.
time.
We need to answer this question for DFF and then we'll move to the audience. So let's make sure we ask it. What do you wish people knew about, sorry, we'll come back to that one. How do you think the session discussion can help imagine a desired long-term future? And I think we'll go across the, so if you want to start. Stephen.
I actually was, let's see if any of them are here in the room. The kind of the beige jumpers with a lot of the Dubai Foundation staff and supporters and so forth. They're participating in this conference just as much as we are, but they're not on panels. They don't have. And you have a different badge than everyone else. But it's kind of like, what would happen if we could poll all of the people making coffee, helping us find our room, sound engineer, keeping us from reverberating. All of these are people as well. What vision do they have? We're in Dubai. We're in this cutting edge sort of city. It's amazing. But what makes Dubai, Dubai? It's a lot of people from all over the world who have found a future, here. Like I've had 2 Pakistani drivers who are saying, I'm in Dubai because my future is my children and I need to be here to get my kids through school in Lahore. So Dubai is the center for the future, but why can't Pakistan do this? Why can't Yemen do this? What's up with Israel and Gaza? Like, why can't we envision these more peaceful, sort of futures?
Very well said.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a trick question. But no, fundamentally, I think we need to appreciate that futures is about people. And we all come with our baggage. We all have our ideas of what we want to see the world become, what we hope it will be for our children if we have them. And what really matters in between is the technology that we have. And it's really not high-tech. How can we be able to speak to one another in a ways that we can be sincere, honest, and forthright about what we hope we want to achieve? I think this is really what, for me, this sort of work teaches me. It's not about going to look for high-tech solutions, because if the people are not part of them, and if they don't feel that they are part of those designs, then they will end up in some kind of mourning. You call it grief, right? But essentially, it's about that. We need to create spaces where we can trust one another, we can feel respected within those spaces, independently of our station in life, and that we can contribute to something that will also serve us. I think the biggest problem of the development paradigm, it has been about pulling people to become something that they didn't necessarily ask or want to be part of. Mm-hmm. And we need to go back and sort of begin to ask, what do these people want to see? And my own work tells me is that these people have ideas, and not all of them are bad ideas. I think they just don't have spaces and means in which they can be respected as they share those ideas.
Brilliant. And, building on that, I think 100%, we should be looking people first, because even the technology tools that we develop are largely used by people or help facilitate the needs of people. And it would be even more amazing if we could expand beyond people to remember that we don't necessarily have dominion over nature, that nature has needs as well, and we rely very much on nature. We have a very symbiotic relationship with nature. And I think building on the part about people too, and from all the research we've read, there's a big part about imagination and potential, because we don't just have physiological impacts, psychological impacts, but grief also prevents people from reaching their full potential. And that potential being reached can help maximize our collective futures. And I love us to think about things in non-zero-sum ways. Think from an abundance mindset, not a scarcity mindset, because scarcity and poverty usually is an issue of allocation and not scarcity, the lack of the resource. So
I think I just want to add one more thing before we go to the audience. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think the thing I want to leave here with, and I think that can help imagine a desired long-term future, is that, especially in Western culture, we're often told to grieve alone, or expected to grieve alone. And to get through grief, you need to be with community and in a collective, and that's how you get through it. And I think if we can use that as we think of desired long-term futures, that can help us process our grief, not keep it buried, talk about it, be open about it, and then also be with other people to know that you're not alone.
Thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists and all of you here. We'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions you might have, and I'll come around with the mic and bring it over. Perfect.
Okay, you go there.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a very insightful session. Thank you for all your inputs. I had two questions. They're a bit different. The first is, when it comes to collectively coming together and getting over your past, there's this concept of competitive victimhood, especially in cases of war. How do you overcome it? Because then it becomes, we suffered more, they suffered more, we did this, they did that. I've been in a room where we had very heated conversations about it with people from different parts of the world, and it was very hard to watch, because I'm more on the humanistic side, and I see grief as grief. I see pain as pain and suffering as suffering. Coming from a family where my father suffered, we have that generational grief as well. That's one. My second question is about personal grief. Now, you mentioned that everyone grieves in their own way. So how are we expected to kind of share that? Because also, as someone who lost my father at a young age, I felt that alienated me more. People were expecting me to get over it or to break down at some point. It's like people's expectations were back and forth. And so thinking of the future and how, to overcome it, I found my own way to overcome it. But how do you push in your agenda to kind of get over it together in a workspace, for instance, setting? I'm not talking about social, I'm talking specifically workspace settings, so that we can, move on and use it for the future.
Thank you for your questions, and great questions. Starting with your second one about looking at workplaces and allowing for a variety of forms of grief, recognizing that everyone has their own way. I think one of the biggest ways we can do is create spaces for people to be authentic, create spaces where we can collect feedback and find out what those unique ways are. And in systems and all, we have limits like minimum and maximum, and sometimes through exposure, we can grow our own limits of what we think grief can show up as, through exposure to other cultures, through exposure to other mindsets, and creating the space where people can show up authentically and feel safe sharing that and be heard in a non-judgmental way. And when it comes to workplaces too, workplaces need to start considering HR functions as not protecting the company from its people, but actually serving the people that are the lifeblood of the company. And there needs to be a few reframes in how we think about these things, I think, at a fundamental level. And
just, I think I can project loud enough. The whole idea that trauma is not just a communal sort of thing. Organizations can also experience trauma. in its own way. And so some of the teams I'm working with are developing kind of a trauma spectrum for even organizations. How can you ideally have an organization that is ultimately just and equality and a well-being sort of organization, all the way to the other end where it's trauma uninformed, where it's just it's traumatizing individuals. And I'm sure many people in this room have worked in organizations where you're like, ick, this is a horrendous sort of environment. But the idea of creating the space for grief, I think sometimes a lot of, again, mental ick needs to just come out. It's like lancing that wound, and it is a messy ordeal. And it's infectious in this if it's not contained, if it's not controlled, and so forth. So I don't think any of us are advocating just throwing it out there. You need to be curating the space for that, and it doesn't happen overnight. You build that, but I think there are ways, and it's going to be culturally contextualized for even in East Africa. Ugandans versus Kenyans versus Tanzanians are all going to do it differently.
100%. And to add to that point really quickly is this idea of even the way we look at checkboxes and we create these cultural monoliths. Like we ask people to check off Asia as if like two siblings living in the same house can be wildly different, and we expect to judge an entire continent, or the fact like the meme going around Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles on the persona diagram look the same, right, by demographics and stats. So.
Yeah, just to respond to your first question, I think this is when two groups that have been aggrieved come in contact, I think this is the first instinct that happens. I suffered more than you, who are you to talk about my suffering? But I have observed when you leave them, it's the initial thing that has to come out. They will find an equilibrium amongst themselves. And actually, in some quote-unquote peace processes, it has been very interesting to observe that people who are on opposite sides actually become, having gone through this cathartic process of letting out what was inside them, they actually find an equilibrium and begin to advocate for the same things. So I think finding spaces where people can actually share what they feel, okay? And most of the time it's because people feel they're not being heard, that this allows them to have the thing that my pain is greater than yours. Mm-hmm. But if you ask a mother who's lost her child, the pain is the same, right? No one can say one is greater than the other. So I think it's just about creating these spaces, making sure they're safe spaces, and that the people can respect one another, and there are not any, power dynamics being pushed within those spaces. Then they'll find their own equilibrium and take their own journey.
Nicely said. You had a question as well, and then you, and then. Okay, let's start. We have got 7 minutes left. There's a lot. I'm seeing a lot of hands in the room. Let's start. I saw your hand first, and then Saha. Saha, you've got the mic, so.
Yeah, so I'll just go. So you've been talking about grief in terms of a historic event. I've been thinking a lot now about how many people are now grieving the future. So, for example, regarding climate, or I've even seen women on TikTok shaving their heads after the US elections. So, is this something you deal with as well?
Yeah, I'm an American, and there's 70 million Americans grieving, along with 75 million celebrating. And so I think the reality, this is maybe even going to the last question you had about, I think we just all need to be ready for this sort of era in the coming years, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's climate. Think of the cities just in Europe that have flooded, that have never seen floods like this at all. I think those sort of events, conflict, movement of people, if governments become more nationalistic and authoritarian and anti-immigrant, not just the United States, anybody, all of a sudden there's going to be massive shifts of people around the world that is going to cause great. So I think one lesson I would love everyone from here to take away from this is, hey, get this in your pocket somehow. Like, be ready to, whether you personally work with this space or not, but be ready to have the resources, because I think you're going to encounter more and more of this in the coming years. There was
a talk in here earlier, and they talked about rather than grieving, it was a quote that was used, but basically it was like, rather than grieving that, this person now had a disability, they couldn't use their body in the same way, and they were like, do I grieve this mundane action that I can't do anymore, or do I think about this is a new experience and how do I move forward with that? So how do I move forward with this new challenge of having that experience that used to be is no longer, and now we have to work in different ways, and we see a lot of resistance. So while the pendulum is swinging one way, the incredible work we see at the ground level in terms of like the housing crisis and how communities are coming together. So it's really about that grassroots movement and how important it is to be connected.
Now, very briefly, I think one of the purpose the work we do is we try and anticipate. Okay, so if we can be able to anticipate what is coming, we can also begin to find antibodies to deal with whatever might be emerging. But more importantly, I think it is also a way to try and empower people and tell them, look, you have something that you can do to help shape the future that you would like to see happening. We are not passive victims just waiting for the future to happen to us. We can do something. Now, what is that something? And that's a conversation.
Thank you. My question is related to what you've talked about, how it is contagious. Now, grief is usually sometimes looked at from the person who is actually the victim. But along the way, it creates a reflective manner. So I'm wondering whether the research has also gotten into trying to trace victims of the victim. Because I could have gone through something, and because I've gone through something, I'm reflecting something around other people who have not gone through what I've gone through. But it's bad, and it creates a culture, and we do certain things where we do them not because I went through a tragic experience, but because you've reflected that on me. So does the research then find a way of forecasting possible people who have gotten in touch with me, and then also try to find ways of how to deal with that, and also some sort of accountability for what? Because it's not like because I am grieved, I should do something not nice to other people. They should also realize that in as much as you're a victim, don't be a bad person to someone else.
You're absolutely spot on correct about the reflection effect. And what we were talking about earlier is that grief starts off at the individual level, but then it affects your immediate circle, right? Moving in concentric circles out from you, your immediate family, your closest relationships, your workspaces. So 100% one person's grief can have this ripple effect throughout their communities and then showing up in workplaces and sometimes even leading at extreme cases to legal issues or major healthcare issues.
There's a scholar who's actually doing research on what she's called dynamic entangled memory mapping. And she's looking at past genocides that have happened in countries 50 to 100 years ago and looking at how that exact experience molds itself over time and creates an entire narrative around what that is. And disentangling that is what's so key to almost change the past in some ways, because certain dominant narratives determine what happened, but there's all those memories surrounding it that are completely marginalized. When you bring them into the equation, I think this is what's related to national level sort of healing and so forth. It's a messy, long process. Rwanda is an example, recent example, that has kind of processed that.
Yeah, just very briefly, and to add to that, I think this also is about the narratives, the stories that we tell about each other. And if we begin to challenge these narratives, I think we begin also to undo and unpack the damage we have. I mean, you probably know as an African, we have stereotypes about other people that are mostly negative. And if you begin to challenge them, then you see people of this community are not all like that. But if we believe and we take it at face value, then we reproduce those elements that are negative and that cause more poison and more harm within the society. So we have to change the stories we tell about each other and how we relate to one another.
100%. And I was trying to go back to pull up a systems map that we were showing earlier, showing exactly that ripple effect and that reflection effect. So thank you for bringing that up. And we'd love to answer every question. So, but we are out of time now, unfortunately. But please come and talk to us after the session. We're at 2:45. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you for a big round of applause for our panelists.
Sign up sheet.
sign-up sheet.
And then we have a sign-up sheet as well outside if anyone would like to learn more or be connected to our research or
And we're
installations.
building a community of practice around this. So if you want to know more about what that looks like, come talk to us. But thank you all for your questions and everything.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Cheers, everybody.